Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to check, is the volume okay for everybody? Okay. My name is Kathi Reister, and I work up at the Duderstadt Center, and I manage the gallery that's in the Duderstadt Center, which is, as of today, hosting the exhibit, The Other of the Other, presented by Professor Lara. So after the talk, hopefully sometime next week, you'll come up and see the exhibit. Our guest tonight is Professor Lara. He is a Brazilian architect, and he studied in Brazil and then got his PhD here at U of M. He is a Wolverine in 2001. He is currently a professor of architecture at the University of Texas in Austin. And in 2015, Professor Lara, along with Luis Carranza,
That's right.
Published the first comprehensive survey of modern architecture in Latin America. And that's what we'll be discussing tonight. I have just a few thank yous to pass on before we get started. First of all, we'd like to thank our sponsors. Both Babette Martins and Howard Tsai from the Brazil Initiative at the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program here at U of M. Also, Lisa Borgsdorf from the Museum of Art here. The Duderstadt Center, thank you for providing space. And Professor Lara. So I'm going to go ahead and let Professor Lara get started.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind introduction. I can't tell you how happy I am to be back in Ann Arbor among so many great friends. For the ones that don't know me that well, I've already lived 10 years of my life in this great city. Lots of great memories, lots of great things from Ann Arbor. But I left Ann Arbor in 2009, and I went to the University of Texas in Austin. And there, I had the chance to lead a quite significant research group on Latin American modern architecture, which is my specialty, has been my specialty. And UT, as many of you know, have a really gigantic Center for Latin American Studies, 230 of us there. 48 of us are Brazilianists. So that density and the invitation of many people that came through Austin in the years 2009, 10, 11, 12 is what helped me put this book together. The idea of writing this book has been in our mind for quite some time. Myself and my co-author, Luis Carranza, a Mexican architect who teaches in Rhode Island, we have always been complaining that every time we have a session in a conference about modern architecture in Latin America, we have to start the history all from the beginning, explain everything again. And we had this frustration that the scholarship was not advancing as we wanted because there was no foundation. So in 2010, we decided, you know what, we have to write this book. The previous generation didn't do it, we have to do it ourselves. So we got together in 2010 and wrote a book proposal. And those of you who have been through assistant professorships and associate professorships know how hard it is to publish a first book. Your first book, you send a couple of proposals, the presses get back to you saying, really interesting, but won't fit in my schedule until 5 years from now, which doesn't work for your promotion, or really interesting, but we are not really into that area, etc. So both of us had already suffered through this process of doing the first book. And we decided, okay, let's write a proposal that is really big and bold. Let's write that we will write more than 700 pages. And let's write that we will have 300 illustrations. Because you know what? They're going to force us to cut to 150. So, right, it's better to tell them that we want 300 color illustrations. And they'll say, no, only 150 black and white, and we'll be happy with it. Well, we sent the proposal to 2 presses, actually, and both of them responded in 24 hours saying, we love the idea, we're going to do it. And then we went with the University of Texas Press because they said, okay, 300 color illustrations. Like, oh my God, now we have to write this thing, and we have to get all of these, etc. So how do you write this? How do you write a survey book? How do you curate a survey book that talks about 20 plus countries in a whole century, in a very busy century, right? So that was what was in our mind since the beginning of the project. And by the way, the book is for sale here, thanks to the Literati bookstore who order and have a table outside selling the book. The book is also not very expensive, thanks to a Latin American endowment by UT Press that covers some of the outrageous costs of so many color images, etc., etc. But we approached the book as a map. We approached the book as a map. And being both of us architects and trained architects, licensed architects, we drew a lot in the process of writing the book. We drew sketches, we drew diagrams, we drew a lot of relationships. We sent over 6,000 emails back and forth during the 5 years that we were working on the book project. And we thought of the book as a map, in a way, following Jorge Luis Borges' little history about the map, little story about the map. So Borges has a little story that talks about a society that was so fascinated with maps. They were so crazy about maps that they decided to do a map on a 1-to-1 scale. And they started drawing like this gigantic map in which everything was represented in its real dimensions. And of course, they abandoned the project because there's no use for a map on a 1-to-1 scale. It's completely useless. So the act of writing the book and the act of doing this as a map is the act of selecting which one are the entry points, which one are the buildings, the architects that are really important, that should be there to help everybody else guide themselves, right? So we want the book to be a map for everybody to use. And in the end of the process of writing the book, when the book was already in the printing process, we were invited to do an exhibition. The exhibition has opened in Austin in March of 2015, and this is the 17th stop of the exhibition. Has been in Madrid, has been in Rio, has been in Santiago, Bogotá, Mexico City, St. Louis, Rhode Island, Fort Lauderdale. It goes to Chicago next year. It goes to, I forgot, city Talca in Chile next year. So what we did for the exhibition that you can see at the Duderstadt Center on North Campus is this gigantic map, is this gigantic diagram. And the idea of writing this diagram is, one, to put all those architecture in a certain position vis-a-vis the others, right? We call it the order of the order because Latin American architecture has always been this order. That is the traditional, conventional modernity of the European centers, and then there's this other modernity elsewhere. And in 2015, exactly at the same time that our exhibition was due to open, the MoMA had a show on modern architecture. So we called ours the order of the order in a relationship with the MoMA exhibition. That MoMA exhibition covered from 1955 to 1980. But putting all those architectures in context allow us to see them in relationship to each other. Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Cuba, all of the Latin American countries. The book mentions every single one of them except Bolivia, as my daughter loves to remind me. We need to do a second edition including the work of Freddy Mamay in Bolivia. But we also did this diagram in opposition to this diagram. This is a page from the Bannister Fletcher's father and son book published in London in the late 19th century. And the Bannister Fletchers, when they wrote the Tree of Architecture, you have the basic disciplines here, geometry, climate, religion, ethics, geography, history, and then you have a trunk, right, of the tree. And the trunk is Greek, Roman, Middle Ages, etc., and then American, US architecture is on top here. Everything else are branches. We know that this is a construction. We know that this Western civilization or the history of Western art was constructed that way during the 18th and 19th century, and we challenge that. And why we challenge that? It's because of this. This is a map that I drew 10 years ago when I was teaching here in Michigan. And I got the 4 most widely used books of modern architecture, surveys of worldwide modern architecture. Kenneth Frampton, Vincent Scully, I lost one. William Curtis, and the modern chapters of Spiro Kostoff, the books that every school of architecture used to teach modern architecture. And I put a little dot for every building mentioned in these books. And the result of those little dots, it's not explicit, it's pornographic. The result of the concentration of their focus on the North Atlantic. It's no coincidence that those books were all written in the late 20th century when NATO is the dominant military alliance of the whole world. History has always been written like that. We know that, right? So because of this outrageous NATO-centrism, we decided we need to write our book, we needed to do the exhibition, we needed to engage this NATO-centric, this North Atlantic-centered knowledge foundation with our own narrative. And then we looked at our own tree of architecture. And I love those little ficus that you can buy anywhere in the world. They are for sale everywhere because they look like a tree, but they are not a tree. They are actually 3 vines that are weaved together. So those are the metaphors that we use to look at the book, the approach of the book. There's a long part. I will skip a little fast here. In the longer version of this presentation, there are a long part about the history of the Americas. I can tell you that after writing this reference book on Latin American architecture, I'm not interested in being a Latin Americanist any longer. I want to be an Americanist. I'm convinced, I discovered in the course of all those decades of research that we share a lot in the Americas, much more than we are aware of. The stratification, the separation of Anglo-America, Spanish America, and Portuguese America is another Eurocentric gift that we received, and it's about time to challenge. So what I'm going to talk about now is about the Americas, not only Latin America. So the Americas have always been that order. I mean, this is the world in the 8th century, right? Europe, Africa, Asia, Jerusalem in the middle, and the Mar Oceano, the ocean surrounding all of the world. This is the world right before the encounter between the American inhabitants and the Europeans that happened after 1492. And I will skip really fast here, but the main point here is the argument developed by Edmundo O'Gorman, Mexican historian, that it was after encountering this continent of ours that the Europeans became central and hegemonic. And the way I learned history in middle school and high school, the way I assume most people learn is that Europe was coming out of the Middle Ages, they were modernizing, economies were being transformed, capitalism was being born, and then they started navigations, and then they found this continent of ours. O'Gorman proposes a different reading, and there's a lot of argument for that, and many people agrees with his reading, including myself, that the order of the factors is a little bit different here, and the orders of the factors do matter, right? Europe, especially the Iberian Peninsula, was still very medieval when they started navigating, first the Portuguese all across Africa, then the Spanish landed here in the Dominican Republic, and then the Portuguese also came, and everybody else came. It's the other way around. It's the encounter with this huge landmass inhabited by people that have been separated from the rest of the world for 15,000 years. It's that encounter that triggered modernity. And the metaphor that O'Gorman used back in the 1940s is more contemporary than ever. The metaphor is that he uses is, imagine if tomorrow we get news that one of our NASA probes found life in another planet. What's going to happen to us if we find any kind of life in another planet? We have to rethink everything we believe about ourselves. That's what happened with the Europeans. Not in 1492, because they thought they had landed in India, but in 1496, 97, 98, 1500, when they realized, oops, this is not India. It's something else here completely. So it's that kind of thing that we want to put in perspective. We also made sure to write a history very much based on Latin American thinkers. In the case, I said I would not say Latin America again, but in the case of the book, it's still about Latin America. So Arturo Escobar from Colombia, that writes about modernization and colonialism. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro from Brazil that talks about the Amerindian perspectivism. Lots of authors that help us frame what the Americas are. And then we did the exhibition as a way to explain that by putting those buildings in context. Continuing with our own local references, this is a very important drawing for us. This is a drawing by Joaquín Torres Garcia, Uruguayan artist that drew that in 1943, and he called that America Invertida. So we use that as a reference. If you look at our buildings here, at our map of the exhibition, we have the south up there. So those are the buildings from Argentina and Chile and Uruguay. Those are the buildings from Brazil. Then you have Colombia over here, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and those are the buildings from Mexico. And this is like New York. We organize it this way. We also organize it very didactically, very pedagogically. We want the book to be read. Any chapter is supposed to be read separately and has to make sense. You can follow all the Mexico chapters. You can follow all the Brazil chapters. And we also divided the buildings and the architects, the chapters of the book, which are 60 chapters, in art, technology, and utopia. So this is the drawing only of the buildings that we talked about from an artistic perspective, how the artistic concepts influence the buildings. And then comes the interesting part of that, which is to use those buildings as references to our students. Using the Villa Mayor house in Uruguay, that from the 1930s, using the O'Gorman house in Mexico City. Those are the Frida and Diego studios that everybody visits. This is the O'Gorman house, built for his father 4 years earlier. This is the Warszawsky's house in São Paulo. So we use those references. Continuing with the Barragan house, with the Niemeyer house for Kubitschek in Pampulha, with the Casa sobre el Arroyo, Amancio Williams in Argentina, the ones that talk about technology, and the ones that talk about utopia. This is schools by the Valparaíso School of Architecture in Chile. This is by Diller Tossige in Argentina, and this is Sérgio Bernardes in Brazil. So our main idea, we believe our main contribution with this book is to use those buildings to teach and talk about architecture. Because in a way, what we are doing is that we are putting our colors in those three different vines, those three different trees, that then together make a different tree of architecture that we hope will be in dialogue with the 19th century one that we had over there. I will stop here now and go back to this diagram because, oops, not the one before, because we can move to the Q&A part of the conversation. Thank you. Please.
Sorry. Here, I'll just sit here.
No, that's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to I have a few questions myself, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So, first of all, I have a question just for you personally. Mm-hmm. When you're designing, what inspires you, and are there architects that have inspired you in particular?
Yeah, I would say that the way I organize my time, I am a scholar 80% or 85% of the time, and a designer only 15% of the time. I do take part in an office in Brazil, but we do mostly public architecture. We do public spaces, we do social housing, we do improvement in the favelas in Brazil. And we were terrifically busy from 2005 to 2014, and now that kind of work have dried out in Brazil with the current political economic crisis. But in that work, what inspires me is to challenge the traditional boundaries of architecture. My practice doesn't design fancy houses for wealthy people. So when we design, for instance, social housing, so let's say there's some construction going on in the favelas, they are turning the alleyways into proper streets, putting sewage mains, etc. Some buildings are demolished. So we get to design new houses for the population, the people who had their houses demolished in the same community. But there is a tremendous gap in vocabulary and I don't want to say knowledge. It's in the vocabulary, it's in the training and the exposure to issues between us, the architects, and the inhabitants, the poorest inhabitants of Brazil who live in those areas. So we do things like we get the bricks and we lay out the apartment on the floor of a basketball court or volleyball court, and we lay out the whole design there in real size. That's a one-to-one map. And then we tell the people, like, the city will pay for 600 square feet. Do you want a larger kitchen? You have to make a smaller bedroom. Do you want 3 bedrooms? 2 of them will be tiny. And we do that by moving the bricks on the floor of the sports center to make sure that we engage the people. So this kind of work makes me very, very happy. But it's also highly frustrating because things get changed or not get built, or we design beautiful little plazas for the inside the favelas. We're called pocket plazas. They win awards, they get published, and then the community decides they want parking spots. They want to have cars, and they want those spaces used for parking. It's not easy.
So can you just tell people, some people may not know what a favela is.
So a favela is the Brazilian name for the informally built settlements. Usually on the traditional construction process, as we know it, you purchase the land, so you have the property of the land, then you design, and then you live there. You design, you build, and then you live there, you occupy. In the informal areas of the planet, where, according to UN Habitat, 40% of the urban population of the planet lives, that's more than almost 2 billion people, which is a little under 20% of the whole global population. The process is the opposite. People first occupy the land, they are there, they take possession of the land, then they build something, and if they are very lucky in the course of many, many years, they get to have property titles and infrastructure. Infrastructure in Brazil now, it's almost everywhere. But property titles is the main problem. And sewage. It's very hard to build sewage after the whole settlement the whole community is built. But we have a group of scholars that work a lot on this, and what we are finding out is that informality is everywhere. It's a matter of degree. California, Silicon Valley has tremendous levels of informality. You look at the property register on a certain city in San Mateo, and it has a house there. And what is registered is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square foot house. But you look at the Google image, and there's 5 other buildings in the backyard of that house where 5 other families or students or somebody else live, paying $1,500 a month that's the only thing affordable in those areas. So we have that in California, we have that very close to Austin. We have that everywhere in the world. In Rio, where I was yesterday, it's about 15 to 18% of the whole population live in those informal areas. In Caracas, a bit more. In Lima, a bit more. Other places, a bit less. But it's a group of characteristics that you can apply to human settlements that nowadays house over 1 billion people in the planet, in urban areas. Not talking about informality in rural areas, only in urban areas.
There was a clip when you have a chance to see the exhibit, there's a clip in one of the films that's included in the exhibit, and there was a statistic that just amazed me, and it was that in the next 35 years, we will need to build as much housing as we have in the last 5,000 years. That seems staggering to me.
That's the challenge.
Is there time even to design? Is there time to, where will they go?
And it's even more urgent, because if we keep building the same way that we have built, so if we build the next, let's say 1 billion people in urban areas need housing, that's 250 million units. If we build them the same way, with the same technology, with the same aspirations, the same levels of consumption that we build for everybody else, climate change would spike, and sea level rise would go 30 feet high, and we're going to need 5 planets to support that. So on top of the urgent need for social sustainability, we have the urgent need for environmental sustainability. And yeah, it's...
That was amazing to me. So getting back to the book, why did you decide to write this book now?
Main reason, because nobody wrote it before. And we have been teaching about it for 15 years, both Carranza and I, and we desperately needed the book. But we thought, we both feel pretty good about the knowledge that we acquired in all those years, and the fact that we are able to translate that into a book that now is ready to be ripped apart by everybody else.
Right.
This is the 17th city of the exhibition. The lecture I probably gave 25 plus, every city, there's somebody that asked me, why didn't you include this building that is so important to me? And it's like, can't include everything. But
So how did you choose? This covers 20 countries and 100 years. So how did you choose the buildings to include, and is there a connection to those buildings?
yeah, between the two of us, we have visited all those buildings. I think both of us have visited 80% of those buildings. And it was a process of curatorial choice from lapidations. And we started with an idea for the structure of the book. We started drafting the chapters in a Dropbox folder, and the other author would take that chapter and work a little bit, etc. And in the end, we had to cut. In the end, was like, does this building really needs a chapter? The manuscript that we delivered was 900 pages. So when the draft got close to 800 pages, we started cutting. And we started deciding, maybe this building is not at exactly the same level as the other one, so this has to be chopped, this has to be chopped. But it's a strong desire to tell a story from the perspective of Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Chile. That's what drove us through the process.
Fantastic. Does anybody have questions? I see a hand up already.
Mitch.
We have had numerous conversations about this desire to erase this line between North and South, which you spoke about. And currently we have elected a president who wants to build that line as a piece of architecture to reinforce that line between North and South. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how an architect may contribute to further erasure.
Thanks. So, for the ones of you in the audience who are not architects or architectural teachers, in architecture we have those design studios. Michigan here has the famous third floor where 600 students are there drawing like crazy throughout the semester. Right now is the most busy time of all. Right before Thanksgiving, they're spending 20 hours a day there in front of their screens and models and drawings. And I always ask myself, why do we do that? I mean, why do I spend 15 hours a week in the studio when I could write 2 books a year with that time? Or why do we put our students through it? And I'm still think it's worth it. And I think this gigantic investment comes with a tremendous responsibility. We have the responsibility to propose things that make the world better. What I really like about the early 20th century avant-garde is that they didn't shy away from that challenge. They took the challenge and they said, I can do a better city. They achieved amazing things and they failed miserably in others, but they took the challenge. So this semester, when I was preparing the brief of my advanced studio, I said, this is it. We have to design the border without a wall. So my 12 students, graduate students, spent the whole semester designing all kinds of infrastructure necessary for the border between the US and Mexico to be as similar to the border between France and Spain or Germany and Netherlands as possible. So they designed the infrastructure necessary to allow people to process freely as possible and to really check this stuff. I mean, we do have problems of drugs coming up north and weapons going south. So they designed that infrastructure. We had a press release ready to go out before the election. The dean, I think quite wisely, asked me to wait. I had no clue. I didn't expect at all the election results. The day after the election, we all cried in studio. Was very heavy, very emotional. And now we have a new press release. So now I had to rephrase the word a little bit, especially after the results of the election. And we are ready to blast the Monday after Thanksgiving, the November 28th, with the approval of the dean and the approval of everything. And our final review is December 2nd. And I think we are contributing something. I think we are contributing to the dialogue of we have to think about the border this way. We might be generations away from it, but it's our responsibility to envision it. So November 28th, the website goes up, and I'll show you the results of what the students did. But yeah, thanks, Meet, for that question.
You talked about how your project responds to certain constructions of a Euro or North American-centric history of architecture. I was wondering if you could address if your book also responds to the sort of current trends in global architectural history, and if so, then how?
Yeah, there is a significant group of architectural historians. I am a part-time architectural historian, I think. I like to go to the conference. I like the discussions. I write history books. But there's a significant group, mostly in Asia, Singapore, Australia, China, Japan, Indonesia, that they are engaged in the rewriting of the history of modern architecture, because the way that the NATO-centric history was written doesn't serve them at all. So that's one significant contribution that I follow closely that is going on. The other significant contribution is the rewriting of the history of architecture from the perspective of gender. There's a significant group of female architects. The ones that I follow more closely are in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, who are, again, rewriting the history from the perspective of gender, because we, on top of being NATO-centric, we're also very male-centric. So I think those rewritings are fundamental. And there's tremendous amount of work to be done.
So does that approach in some ways respond to these?
Oh yeah. I mean, the book we focus on Latin America, but we are in dialogue with post-colonialist studies, with the whole tradition of challenging the Eurocentric canon that came up strongly at the end of the previous century. Yeah, this is part of our reference, our framework. Yes, Wen.
So I was really interested. Well, there's just a comment and then a question about something you just said. So the comment is I guess I'm sort of Brazil-centric, and I expected if you've got the southern cone at the top in Brazil, I always imagined Brazil as the heart of modern architecture and a place where there was way more done in the 30s through the 60s through 1960 than anywhere else in the world. So I was surprised to see so much, especially in the middle, you've got so much balance. I mean, it's really not top heavy. So that was just an
Brazil is here. So this would be the Brazil line. In the printed banner, you can see the latitudes. They are written here and here. But Brazil would be this.
So is that a reflection of your attempt to give this balance, or is that a reflection of the distribution of modern architecture?
One of the reviewers, the scholars who did the review for the press, did the math for us and counted every building mentioned, every entry mentioned. And Brazil is the most prominent in the book. Mexico is second, and Argentina is third. I think Brazil does have a strong leadership in modern architecture. If you follow this line here, you can see that it started a little later, right? You have some Mexican examples as early as the 20s and 30s, and then Brazil really picks up a lot of momentum after 1936, 1940, Estado Novo, Getúlio Vargas, etc. What I also love about this diagram is the voids. What happened here? Why do we have this huge void in the 1980s? I mean, década perdida, the financial crisis, etc. And I think what makes me happy about this is that it makes us talk about those relationships. The scholar that we choose to write the preface of the book is an Argentinian one, and he raised a very strong polemic or in dialogue with us. I mean, the issue of nationalism versus modernism. According to him, to be fully modern, you cannot be national. If you are national in your representation, in your style, you are less modern. Of course, he's Argentinian, and Argentina never had strong state support for modern architecture. So the great examples of architecture that we have here, and by the way, there is an accumulation of buildings on this line here, because it happens that Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Montevideo are in almost the same latitude. They are all 34, 35 degrees south. And Montevideo is the southernmost of those three. So it fools us a little bit, because the upper line there is 3 countries. But the heroes of modern architecture in Argentina were all working for the private sector. It's very different from Brazil and Mexico, where the great architects were working for the state and for the state infrastructure. So all those things are part of the book conversation. And what is great from my perspective is to overlap that with the political economy history of all those countries. And I would love someday to see a map like that of the political, economical, social events, to see how they match the architecture map, if they match at all.
I think we have a gentleman in the middle there. Maybe 5 rows back. Maybe not, maybe he was just stretching.
I had another question. So my second question was, you mentioned that in the modernists from the beginning of the century, they were willing to take on the challenge to meet this challenge of making the world better, and they had some great success and some terrible failures. So I wondered if you could tell us what your favorite example of each is, and whether you had that tension running through the book.
So
was that
favorite example of each? In Rio de Janeiro, there's an architect called Afonso Reidi. Not many people know about him. Niemeyer took the whole stage in the 1950s and 60s, but Reidi has a series of buildings that he designed social housing for the city of Rio in the 1940s, 46, 47, and his concept of social housing, together with Carmen Portinho, who was a female engineer, who was his boss and head of the construction department of Rio. Their idea of housing was the families will live in a very small cell, very small 500 square feet unit, families of 4 or 5 seats, because the building will have communal kitchen, communal laundry, communal daycare. And fathers and mothers will rotate to run the kitchen, the daycare, and the laundry, so that the kids will be taken care of inside that complex, and the women will have the freedom to do whatever they wanted with their time, mostly go to the labor force and work and be more independent. Now, you contrast that with Parque Guinle in Rio, built at exactly the same time, 1946-47, which is on a private estate at the beginning of Rua das Laranjeiras, right when you end Largo do Machado and start going up. And the apartments at Partidinli for the Brazilian elite of the time have 3,000 square feet. And they have 2 maids' rooms and separate elevators, which is a feature of Brazilian architecture from then on. 2 maids' rooms, 3,000 square feet. Now, you project those 2 ideas of modernity in time, and you see that Brazilian society, but almost all societies in the Americas, abandoned the more socialist equality project and embraced the project of verticalization, in which cheap labor of the Brazilian maids is fundamental to make that work. So those proposals were there, and at some point society abandoned one and embraced the other. In Mexico, you have these people like, what's his name? I won't forget the name. I won't remember the name of the Mexican architect. It will take a few minutes. He was trying to engage issues of ancient American architecture, and he was looking at ancient settlements all over North America in order to inspire his buildings. Lima, Peru. Lima, Peru has a fantastic example. A little later, in the mid-60s, Peru elected an architect for president. His name was, Fernando, I don't remember the Fernando, of course. Come back to me in a second. But this man engaged the United Nations and proposed a competition called Previ in the outskirts of Lima. Belaún de Terre, Fernando Belaún de Terre is the name of the president. And that competition in the 1960s was so revolutionary. Well, first, he invited 12 of the most famous architects of the whole world. If I drop the names, my architectural friends will know every single one of them. It's Aldo van Eyck, it's Christopher Alexander, it's Charles Correa, who was a alumni. It's Candiles and Woods, it's James Sterling, the best of 1966. And he and the UN advisors told the architects, you have to design a small cell, and we will build a small cell for the people, and they will incrementally add to that. So you have to design in a way that can be added later by the people themselves. We call that incrementalism. And they did it. There was a military coup in Peru. Belaún de Terre was deposed, but they finished the construction of the houses. They inaugurated that in the early 70s, and it's there. To this day, it's a great neighborhood on the outskirts of Lima. And incrementalism has been picked up on and off, and there was always somebody talking about that as a great way to get the economies of scale of the construction industry and the flexibility of the informal processes, etc. And then this millennium, a young Chilean architect, graduate of Harvard, picks up the idea, calls it Elemental, builds a couple of housing complexes in Chile, and wins the Pritzker Prize last year, the largest, biggest prize of architecture. Probably the youngest architect ever to win the Pritzker Prize. So the seed of the idea was way back there in 1966, and nobody paid much attention to Previ, despite the fact that the most famous architects were involved in it. And then 50 years later, it becomes the hottest thing in architecture, and the Chilean, who's a really good architect, by the way, wins the Pritzker Prize because of that. So sometimes ideas takes like 50 years to really flourish. That's why we need to design the border without a wall now.
Fernando, I'm interested in this idea about being an Americanist versus a Latin Americanist. And if you think about the, suppose you took, we know what was happening in Mexico compared to what was happening in Brazil or Argentina at a given point in time, and you compared it to what was happening in New York or Chicago or something like that. Are there more similarities between what's happening in Mexico and Brazil, or more similarities between what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in New York? I guess just to test your thesis of, is there a Latin American connection to all of this? Are the Mexicans paying attention more to the Brazilians or the New Yorkers?
I think what I'm interested in developing right now is, if we look at the 19th and 20th century, the differences are bigger than the similarities. The industrialization process in the US was much earlier than any other country in the Americas. And the way that land was organized, especially in the 19th century, also starts to differentiate strongly from the Latin American countries. But if we take a longer perspective, if we take a little bit of the longue durée to look at those issues, there's a lot of things that are striking. Like, Mexico was the largest economy in the Americas until the early 19th century, until 1820s, if I'm not mistaken. The economy, the GDP of Mexico was still larger than the 20 so states that had already joined the 13 states by that time. If we look at the issue of land ownership and land expropriation, it's so similar. It's so very similar. And I'm actually fascinated by going way back, following the anthropologists when they developed this theory, for instance, of the Amerindian perspectivism, which is common threads in the culture of all of the Americas in the relationship between us and nature. I mean, in the West, we separate us from nature. There's us, human beings, and there's everything else. For most of the Amerindians, things become humanized if you deal with them. So a pebble has no humanness in the creek. But if you take that pebble, you polish it, and you make a necklace out of it, it becomes human. It's a completely different relationship with nature, and one that we really need now, given our environmental challenge. So what I'm trying to do is to stretch in time a little bit more to look at the similarities. If we focus on 19th and 20th century, they are very different. And then by late 20th century, things start to converge, right? Leticia doesn't like me to mention that, but she thinks that the Gini coefficient is not a good measure of inequality, and she has much better ways to measure inequality. But the Gini coefficient of Brazil and US have converged drastically in the 21st century, from 2003 until 2014. And then Brazil bounces up again, and the US, I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I don't expect it to be any better in 2015 than it was in 2014. So I think the convergences are there. And in the issues of, like, our cities are all low density. We have issues of sprawl, we have the issues of low density. They have always been low density. The cities before the arrival of the Europeans were low density, with the exception of Cusco and Tenochtitlan. So there are things there. I think there are things there to keep me busy for a while.
I also wanted to ask you about talking about becoming an Americanist, but maybe if you could speak a little bit more about how this work on modern architecture in Latin America connects to a history of modern architecture inclusive of the United States and Europe for that point, right? Because we have many practitioners and pedagogues who are moving back and forth.
Yeah, I can. Well, I can start from Kathi browsing the book here right before the presentation, and she was browsing the book and she looked at a building and says, "Wow, this is so 1970s," except that it's 1944 in Mexico. When we look at modern architecture, it was tested in Latin America, was built in Latin America before being accepted in the US. There are dozens of buildings, highly modern buildings in Latin America that were built before the Lever House. The issue of, one of my PhD students from Venezuela defended his dissertation 2 years ago on modern architecture in Venezuela, and he looked at North American architects working for the oil companies who built modern skyscrapers in Venezuela in the 1940s, way before anybody had the chance to build the same in New York, much less to talk about Houston, where they were from. So I think that story needs to be told in parallel. I think what I need to do is to continue this line down here and put the greatest North American buildings, or let's say US buildings, because Mexico is in North America. So put the greatest US buildings down here in that diagram to enhance that conversation. I can tell you a great anecdote that is not in the book, but it's in another paper of mine. Frank Lloyd Wright went to Brazil in 1931 to be the judge of a competition that the Organization of American States, it was called Society of American States at that time, put together for the lighthouse, Columbus Lighthouse in the Dominican Republic. So Frank Lloyd Wright goes to Rio, and he wrote in his diary that he was in Rio, and he extended the hand to somebody and said, "Very nice to meet you, Frank Lloyd Wright, American architect." And the other person said, "Nice to meet you, Carlos Leão, American architect." And what do you mean? I mean, well, I'm an American architect. We live in the Americas. And then Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Oh, yes, that's right." And he came back, and he started working on the Usonian houses in response to that realization that America is the whole continent, and not only one country that kind of kidnapped the name. So if we continue exploring that, I'm sure there's a whole lot more that we'll talk about this great adventure of building modernism in the Americas. So many issues are the same, like diaspora of Jewish and socialist and communist architects in the 1930s. Many of them came here and had fantastic careers, and hundreds of them went to Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico and had fantastic careers. So we need to put all that in perspective and talk about that exchange. And then much later, in the last 15 years, there's a tremendous movement of connection that never happened before. The architects up until the 1980s, even the 90s, they knew of each other's work, but very few knew each other architects. Now they all know each other. The greatest architects of the Americas, they are in Santiago, they are in Buenos Aires, they are in Bogotá, they are in Rio, they are in Minneapolis, they are in Chicago, they are in Miami many times per year. And they know each other and they follow each other. I think it's a completely different landscape nowadays, where websites brings the latest buildings in Lima, Peru, or Quito, Ecuador, to talk about a place that has amazing contemporary architecture, to students all over the world almost in real time. Like you take the photo there, it's published next week.
Back.
Yes, you mentioned you did a fair amount of work with social housing in favelas. Are there any things that you've identified that work and don't work on a whole Latin American basis?
Yeah. This great generation that I speak so highly of, the generation of the 1930s and 40s, their approach to the favelas was, let's demolish everything and build something else. And that was a tremendous failure everywhere. Was a failure in Caracas, when I can tell you the story of 23 de Enero, which is a great story. It was a failure in Rio, it was a failure in Buenos Aires. And only much later, in the 1980s, people started asking, oh, wait a minute, those buildings already exist. It's already a lot of money invested here. How can we improve those communities? How can we improve those settlements without displacing the people? And then you have the examples of Rio, Medellin, Lima nowadays, Caracas, despite the tremendous financial strains of Venezuela. So there's a whole new consensus in the last 20, 25 years that the challenge is to bring the infrastructure to the barriadas or favelas or villas misérias without moving the people, without disrupting and dislocating people, because it's much worse if you break people's social relationships and their relationships to jobs and schools and etc. So that's the one kind of consensual thread of.
It just occurred to me, with everything that's going on, that happened in Rio with the Olympics and all the displacement, can you speak to that a little bit? We never talked about this.
The mega events of the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil was a perfect excuse to set the clock back. Brazil had tremendous advance in housing rights from the mid-80s, at the end of the previous dictatorship, to 2010, I would say. And then it starts a huge movement that I call that movement the great leap forward in rights. And then now we are going several steps backwards in rights. And the World Cup was bad, and it sparked the protests in 2013 in Brazil that were gigantic, etc. But the Olympics were much, much worse. Over 50,000 people were displaced in Rio, removed from their informal housing in the areas that are deemed worth of value, and either got some cash or were removed to the westmost periphery of Rio, an hour and a half away in public transportation from where they lived before. So, and I think what we are experiencing in Brazil now with the coup this year is the culmination of that regressive process that actually started a little earlier. Yes, Kush.
Fernando, there's been a long-standing and complete project of ours that connects India and South Africa and Brazil with the different India. But I want to just sort of build upon that question of connection and South-to-South connection. When you talk about North-South connection, sort of looking at Americas, and you briefly hinted or talked about these historians and Indonesia and in other parts of Global South. And could you speak a little bit about how this project connects or informs that conversation?
Yeah, it's there's a group based in it's ironically that they're based in Cambridge, UK, but they're called Cities South of Cancer. We invented that term 15 years ago. We took the Tropic of Cancer as a cutoff line, and we were looking at issues south of the Tropic of Cancer. There's this very strong group in Asia. There's much more interest. The opportunity to travel throughout the Americas with this exhibition this past 18 months now have taught me that everybody is interested in that. It's not only the Southern students who are interested in those relationships. It's everybody. There's people in Minneapolis are interested, people in Fort Lauderdale are interested, people in Munich, Germany are interested in that, in seeing the world from different lenses. There's a certain exhaustion of the NATO-centric paradigm, perhaps because the NATO-centric countries are in as deep trouble as Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela nowadays. But I think there's a growing interest, a growing investment in that kind of conversation.
Two more questions.
Actually.
Say yes to the announcement.
Okay.
I'm just confirming she's right.
Anyone?
I'm curious, you mentioned how advanced Latin America was compared to the global north, or particularly the United States, in terms of modernist architecture coming in the 30s and 40s. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the sort of political or social dynamics that you see as driving that. Besides, just this group of architects, there seemed to be a political history there that's really interesting to overlay on this. As
I think in order to answer that, I'll go back to my first book and PhD dissertation that I did here at U of M. And I looked at the Brazilian middle class in the 1950s, building modern architecture without architects. And one of the drivers for that very unique dissemination was that people were hungry for modernity. So people in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico, they were very hungry for modernity. And they took modernism, modern architecture, as a proxy for modernity. Real modernity would take a while to arrive in terms of changes in education, changes in technology, job market. But to build a modern house, it's boom, you're modern. So I think there's a bit of that. And there's also a certain openness to the new. There's a certain fascination with the new, which at that time was extremely Eurocentric, right? I mean, the great architects of Latin America at that time, they were all looking to Paris. They were all trained in Paris or trained in Italy. Very few of them trained in England or the US. You find the US-trained architects in Colombia and Venezuela and Peru, but not in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Those were all, if they were not, I mean, the Brazilians were mostly trained in Brazil, but if not, they spent some time in France or in Italy. So there was a strong hunger for modernity that Beatriz Colomina, professor at Princeton, has a series of books, and she shows very well how in the US, the appliances fulfilled that hunger. That hunger for modernity came in the form of the dishwasher and the blender, while the house was still very much the same house as the 19th century. I have to say that when I first landed here in Ann Arbor, 1996, and I was driving around and I was like, where are the modern houses? You know, we look at those beautiful architectural magazines from the US and they have those amazing houses. And so many of them are in Michigan. Where are they? They are not the normal fabric of the city. They are the 3-acre properties, you know, half an hour away. And the traditional fabric of the city still looks 19th century. The brand new ones being built here still look 19th century to me. So there's a cognitive dissonance there between how do you fulfill your aspirations of modernity.
I'm not an architecture person, but I really, so maybe more so, I appreciate your connecting and weaving and showing me how the political and economic, political, cultural, and ethical and economic lives of people are so intertwined with architecture, and you clearly have that perspective, and I really like it. My second thing is that I learned, I'm embarrassed to say this, I guess, but I learned most of my history of Latin America and South America from Dario Fo, and his wonderful story, The Discovery of the Americas. So that'll tell you where my mind is. Putting those together, a lot of us cried the day after the election. So I wonder if you could, and I'm saying this seriously, but you can take it tongue-in-cheek if you want, but it's very serious. If you would volunteer to build the wall, or at least a good part of it, and educate our president-elect by, instead of building a wall, build well, it would be long, but it wouldn't be as thin as a wall. A psychoanalytic center, the largest one in the world, to treat all the people that we have messed up with our, that the United States has messed up with our, let's say, trade policies, under the table trade policies. So anyway, mainly I wanted to thank you for an
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
But you don't want to design the facility?
No, I want to design the facility to allow people to cross freely. I want to design the facility to make sure that we stop drugs coming north, we stop weapons going south, and allow people to cross freely. And it's not that hard. We go through it every week on the airports. You just take your backpack over there and cross over here, and which in the border means take your car over there and cross over here. And those things can be thoroughly checked. But what we really want is a full open border. Economists I have followed economists' calculations that if we open trade all over the planet, the GDP of the planet would grow 20–25%. But if we open borders, the GDP would triple. Now, we don't have enough planet or resources to triple any GDPs, but it's a clear indication that open borders for people are more profitable and more sustainable than just opening the border for trade. I think it's a good point to end.
I think so. I think that was a good ending note. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Babette Martins and Howard Tsai from the Brazil Initiative at the Latin and Caribbean Studies program. Also Lisa Borgsdorf here at the University of the museum. And of course the Duderstadt Center. Hopefully you'll all come up and see the exhibit now. And again, most important, on your way out, pick up the book from Literary Bookstore.
Yes.
They're up in the lobby. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for the event.
Thanks for coming.